Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you on a Wednesday evening, and a real pleasure to welcome to the program, I believe for the first time, Professor Alan Guelzo, who's a professor of politics at Princeton University and visiting scholar at Heritage. Now, if that didn't pique your curiosity already, Professor Guelzo and I have in common that we were both born overseas in Asia because we're both military kids. He has a son in the military. He is a professor, and he stirs up controversy wherever he goes. He even got himself in trouble by saying that blogging, historical blogging or blogging by professors is a pernicious waste of time, and I tend to agree with him on that. Professor Guelzo, welcome to the program. How are you?
Well, with an introduction like that, I better mind what I'm saying next.
you have a fascinating...
Can I correct one thing? I'm not a professor of politics. I'm a senior research scholar in the Council of the Humanities at Princeton. That's just in case anyone in the politics department says, who? I've never heard of him before.
Well, the other thing is you're the director of the Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship in the James Madison program at Princeton, which I have to admire that as well because Madison's one of my heroes. But it has to make you, I'm guessing you're a conservative, if you're also at Heritage as a visiting scholar, as a conservative at Princeton University, does that qualify you for minority status?
I have never taken a poll.
Okay, fair enough. It's probably interesting when the faculty gets together in the faculty lounge. I have a feeling a lot of your fellow professors may be a bit different than you are, but I want to hit the question at you this way because America has dealt with pandemics before, and I'll cite another part of the professor's background. His first of many degrees was in biblical studies, which means you should know all about plagues. So what should we do in a pandemic like this and the kind of political complications that creates in a country like ours, since America has seen this happen before?
Well, if you're taking the biblical example, you can always go back to the Exodus and say that the best example was set by Moses, and that is leave town.
Okay.
And
that's
in
not
fact,
exactly
that is,
an option.
so to speak, what a number of political leaders in American history have done. They've quite literally left town. George Washington, all right, first president. This is the man who is the father of our country.
Yep.
When the yellow fever broke out in Philadelphia in August of 1793, now this is when Philadelphia is the capital of the United States. There's 10 years between 1790 and 1800 before Washington, D.C. Is built up. Washington lives in Philadelphia. Congress meets in Philadelphia. The federal government is headquartered in Philadelphia. 1793, late in the summer, the yellow fever hits. What does Washington do? Washington leaves town. He leaves Philadelphia on September 10th, and he goes home to Mount Vernon, and he stays there until November. In fact, he might have stayed there longer because he was still dickering with the idea, should Congress actually meet? Congress is scheduled to meet in December. Are the conditions such that maybe they shouldn't come there? Maybe she designated an alternative location. Washington did not step forward and say, I'm going to be on the front lines, I'm going to be in the emergency rooms. Of course, they didn't really have emergency rooms then. But he's not there giving briefings. He's not there giving interviews. He's just not there at all. And Philadelphia was in a parlous way with this yellow fever. I mean, there's about 22, maybe 23,000 people in the city of Philadelphia in 1793.
Tiny.
When the yellow fever hits, it kills 5,000 people. 11,000 people contract the disease. It's so bad, it's looked upon as so dangerous that vigilantes in Trenton and Lambertville, on the other side of the Delaware River from Pennsylvania,
Yep.
Vigilantes would prevent people from Philadelphia from coming over on the ferry for fear that they were going to spread this. So it's really, really bad. I mean, if you think social distancing was something just invented, goodness, social distancing was being practiced en masse in Philadelphia in 1793. But the greatest social distance was the social distance that George Washington adopts.
He leaves town. Well, didn't he have a...
I have to add, too, this stands in contrast to the mayor of Philadelphia, Matthew Clarkson. That guy stays on the job, stays in his office. He loses his wife and his youngest child to the yellow fever, but he stays at his post. He's in there every day. He keeps the streets clean and clear. He is the real hero of this first major epidemic in the national capital.
Yeah, and in fact, Washington had some experience because during the Revolutionary War, didn't they have in effect, in New York, in what is now New York State, he won some victories because his troops were sick, but less sick than the British troops were because Martha had insisted on pushing inoculation, which was probably viewed with as much suspicion as certain medical people are today.
Well, that's true. Although in that particular moment, Washington is the commander of the Continental Army. He doesn't really have the option of going home to Mount Vernon. He's not a civilian. He has a military obligation. He's got a military duty to stay with the Army, and so he does. So all credit to him on that. What is interesting, though, is when he's president, when he's a civilian, he doesn't see that his obligations as President of the United States extend to being the chief public health officer of the Republic. And so he leaves. And he's not the only president that does this. It happens again with Andrew Jackson, and in large measure it happens yet again with Woodrow Wilson at the time of the Spanish flu in 1918.
So in this case, I want to switch gears just a bit and ask you about what seems to be a really heavy reliance by the states and cities of this great country on the federal government, even though the states have the constitutional authority to act, and public health is one of their primary jobs, and yet virtually all of them, not all of them, but a great number of them, have turned to the federal government and said, what should we do, and send us this stuff.
Well, I think that's a marker of how much the center of political gravity has changed in the United States in the years, even since 1918, over the last century, where increasingly we look to Washington, D.C. as the source and the fountain of direction, of funding, of control. Whether that was exactly what was in view in terms of the Constitution and the founders, this is another question. Certainly it was not seen that way at the time of these earlier pandemics, and certainly wasn't even seen as late as 1918. But today, because we are in now the habit of looking to Washington as being the fountainhead for all the good things that we're supposed to get, attention swivels to Washington, D.C., and we expect Washington, D.C. to provide the funding. We expect the president to do the constant calling of what is this and what is that and what is the other. And I think that that's, first of all, expecting much, much more of any government than it can possibly do. And secondly, it's expecting much, much more of what presidents can do, either as presidents in terms of their constitutional definition, or presidents simply in terms of being human beings and not being able to know everything.
You know, I want to know if that's healthy and tell me if this comparison is wrong, because it keeps occurring to me. I'm not the biggest fan of NATO, what it is today, but what it was very important. But the basic idea was you have this collection of states, countries, and you tell them you all have to spend on your own defense. And if you do a reasonably good job of that, we won't have to come to your rescue very often, but we're there to back you up when necessary. I think of the United States that way and think if New York and California and Washington and Iowa and everybody else does a very good job of being fairly self-sufficient, they won't have to turn to D.C. very often for help. And when they do, the help will be available. Instead, we saw almost all the 50 states saying, we're short, send us some. And that doesn't seem like a healthy way for a country to be, either during the China virus or after.
Well, I don't think that it is either, and I think one major reason why it isn't is because one size does not fit all. Viruses, I'm going to step away from being a history person, which is what I am professionally. A virus is such a strange biological phenomenon. It shifts, it changes, it moves very quickly. That, of course, has been one of the reasons why this particular virus, this coronavirus, has been so deadly. It's very unpredictable. Mm-hmm. As soon as you turn to an entity as large as the federal government, you're asking, in a sense, for a very large, cumbersome, and unwieldy organization to try to deal with a biological phenomenon that is very fast, very unpredictable, and wickedly lethal.
Professor, hold that thought for a moment. Professor, I want to ask you to stay for another segment, if you wouldn't mind, a few more minutes.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Professor Alan Guelzo is with me right now. We'll be back in just a moment.
The Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's a real pleasure to have on the program with me Professor Alan Guelzo, who is at Princeton University, but a visiting scholar at Heritage. Professor, if you'll allow me the latitude, and you've allowed me a fair amount up till this point, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Professor Alan Guelzo is he's a military brat. His dad was in Japan in the occupation of Japan after World War II. And I imagine they had some stay-at-home orders during those times. I just saw that just moments ago, Florida announced it's going to begin lifting its stay-at-home orders on Monday. And I want to ask you about that and about the way that the states are interacting with the federal government. And we've talked about a bit of that in terms of resources and that sort of thing. But the president a couple of weeks ago came out, and I think he did it as a rope-a-dope with the governors. He wanted them to take charge, and they some of them were and some weren't. So he said, okay, I'm in charge of telling you when you can reopen your state. And they all immediately responded by saying, no, we're in charge. We're calling the shots, which I think is exactly what he wanted them to do. But I want to know whether we lose some of that 50 laboratories of democracy, which I've always thought is a powerful force, if these states become so dependent on the federal government that they begin to answer to the federal government and or turn to them and say, we can't decide to reopen our state. The president has to tell us that we've met the criteria. And whether we're losing something more than just the independence of those 50 states, but whether their people, their citizens are losing something because they no longer have a governor who will make decisions for them. They just turn to the feds and say, what do you want us to do?
Well, I think we certainly lose a great deal, and we lose it in practical terms, and we lose it in larger theoretical terms of what our Constitution says. But let me just for a moment dwell on the practical aspect of it. Here you have a nation of 330 million people, 50 states. It is a huge nation. The idea that the national government is going to be in a position to be able to speak to every exigency about this coronavirus epidemic is like saying that a brontosaurus should compete in a foot race with a roadrunner. It's simply too big and too clumsy to be able to speak to every situation because the virus itself is such a changeling. It's different in different places. It's different in different states. It's even different within those states. It's the states themselves that are the ones who are best acquainted with how to do it. What role should the federal government have? It should have the federal government should have the role of saying, all right, here are some basic parameters. This is why I love Dr. Birx. This is why I love Dr. Fauci. I think they both ought to get the Presidential Medal of Freedom at the end of this. Probably. They lay this out and they say, here are some basic ground rules. And the federal government can step up and say, here are some things that we can do to make things happen in the states and in the private sector. But that's, you see, exactly the way we did things, the right way we did things, in World War II. In World War II, what did we do? We're faced with a major crisis. Does the federal government try to build all the ships? Does it try to build all the bombers? No. It says to Henry Kaiser, we'll provide you with basic funding and parameters and dimensions. You find a way of building these things. When Kaiser Shipyard started building Liberty ships, the original Liberty ships were supposed to take as much as 8 months to build. By 1944, they are able to put together a Liberty ship in 4 days. How are they able to do that? It's their own inventiveness, their own ingenuity. In fact, in large measure, part of that whole project was 250 employees writing letters to Henry Kaiser suggesting ways they can speed up the process. Henry Ford, same story. In 1941, when the first B-24s are being built, what are they building? They're supposed to do 75 a month. All right, well, they reached that 75-month limit in 1943, and they keep on going. By 1944, they're turning out 432 bombers a month out of this huge mammoth factory that Ford builds. Here was the role the federal government was playing. It was enabling states, individuals, Americans as a whole to speak to individual situations, and they did it magnificently. That was what made us the arsenal of democracy. Today, what are we looking at? We're looking at a great national crisis. So what should the relationship of the federal government be in this? I would say, look, we have a model in how we won World War II. Why aren't we going to go back to that model now in how we deal with coronavirus?
Professor Guelzo, I don't know if I'm a fan of the president. I don't agree with everything he does, but I've supported him. I will support him. And I'll tell my audience when I think he's wrong. And I thought he was trying very hard to get the states to do that when they were complaining, we're short of ventilators. He goes, go to your local companies and see what they can do for you. Because I know he has more muscle and a bigger bully pulpit. But frankly, some states were turning to universities and saying, can you do testing? And the university said, yeah, we can do testing. And private companies saying, hey, we can do this. The president pushed awfully hard to get states to do that. And an awful lot of the states were responding by saying, well, we can't do it. You have to do it. And I never understood that when you finally have what governors, I mean, I don't think they wish for crises, but when you have a crisis, this is what we hired you for. Not to be the captain of a ship that's just sailing straight and level in calm weather. We're hiring you for the emergencies. And when the emergency pops up, it's like airline pilots who take off, they land, they take off, they land. And most of the time, they don't have to do anything complicated. What you've really got them up front for is to make sure that when something goes wrong, that they're the people who becomes the Captain Sully Sullenberger who can put the plane on the river without killing anybody. That's what we hired you to do. And some of them seemingly didn't take the president's hint. Turn to private industry. Don't go after them with a big sledgehammer of the National Defense Production Act. Ask them. Most of them will say, sure, we'd be glad to do that. And so few of them did.
Once again, this is what we did in World War II. And if it worked in World War II, as it plainly did, why is it not going to work now?
There's no reason for it not to work now. So one other issue, and I want to bring it up, and it's the president has now said to some of these states, and one of his issues that I do support him on is the issue of sanctuary states. For years now, literally years, the president's been told by the states, to hell with you, we're not helping you enforce immigration law, even though it is the federal government's job to do that. In fact, we'll work at cross purposes and keep you from enforcing it in our states. Now, all of a sudden, the shoe's on the other foot. The states are saying, we need all this stuff. And the president says, yep, I'll help you out, but you're going to have to straighten things out. You can't be spending money on a bunch of illegal aliens when you say your own state is in such dire crisis that people are dying. And the states are now pushing back, saying, no, we don't want to have to do that, to comply with you saying you get the help if you're willing to help us out with another problem that is to some extent related.
I wish somebody would call the sanctuary cities for what this really is. This is nullification. And nullification was a constitutional problem that I thought was dead and buried by Andrew Jackson back in 1832 when the slaveholders in South Carolina thought that they were going to nullify federal law, in this case the federal tariff, as a way of protecting their status as slaveholders and protecting slavery. And when we dealt with nullification, when Andrew Jackson dealt forthrightly with nullification, then that issue got buried. There is a clause in the Constitution of the United States which talks about supremacy, and that supremacy clause makes impossible the idea that states can nullify federal law simply by a wave of the legislative hand and call it sanctuary cities. That's not sanctuary cities. That's nullification. That was the doctrine defended by John Calhoun and South Carolina and all the pro-slavery forces. It was nullification then. It's nullification now. Let's call it that and treat it that way and make it clear that if states are going to expect to be part of the federal union and benefit from being part of the federal union, then they have to play ball by the Constitution, by the supremacy clause, and abandon this idea of nullifying federal statutes whenever they feel like it.
Professor Guelzo, it is a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure you're a delight at Heritage. We really appreciate the time, and we'll look forward to having you back.
You bet.